Shalom, shalom, shalom. First thing and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rahakwadash. Secondly, I want to give double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone who taught me this truth in righteousness and in sincerity. The title of this lesson is going to be, It's the Lord that gives the increase. Once again, it's the Lord that gives the increase. So I'm going to start this lesson off with the book of Mark, chapter 4 and verse 14. And it reads, the sower soweth the word. So the sowers being the prophets, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, the Heavenly Father in the name of the Son, they have sent the prophets to preach this truth. This truth has been entrusted to specific men, that are incarnated upon the earth today, and through the, will and power of the Heavenly Father, giving everything into the hand of the Son, and the Son, establishing the will of the Father, those specific men, those prophets of the elect, being elected to be sanctified, which means being set apart from this world, and the reason they're set apart is because pretty much they are endowed with the spirit of the Heavenly Father, having all of the pollution of this world washed away from them, learning the name of their Heavenly Father, learning their true nationality. They have been refreshed, and they have been baptized, the pollution that they were born into has been washed away from them, so that they can be fit for the Father's use in sowing this word. So the sower soweth the word, verse 15, and these are they by the wayside where the word is sown. But when they have heard, Satan cometh immediately and taketh away the word that was sown in their hearts. And you see that happen all the time. Whether it's out on the highways and byways, you got somebody to come up while, the prophets are preaching, while they're speaking this word, and you will have an Israelite that approaches the camp, and, the word begins to be brought out, and they are taught. Salakia, I got a call, but so you will see, Israelite will come up to the camp. You got the prophets bringing out the word to them, and they're hearing the word, and they're digesting it. It's some of the, scriptures and the topics that brothers will bring out. The Israelite that approached the camp, they might be understanding certain things, and then other things they might be a little iffy about, because you know how our people in the world are. For example, they cannot get down with the fact that everybody is not going to be saved. That Yahweh Shai, whom the world calls Jesus Christ, he did not, sacrifice himself for the entire earth, like for everybody on earth, and he didn't even, when it comes to like being saved from this destruction, the elect are the only ones that are going to be receiving that mercy to be preserved from that fire that's coming through those nukes. It's not going to be the entire nation of Israel either. So that whole doctrine of everybody being saved is one example. You'll have an Israelite, listening to the word, and then, they understanding, they being quiet, humble, and then out of nowhere you would have a demon come out of nowhere and start scoffing, you know, start trying to talk to the person that's, the brother that's listening, you know, trying to whisper in his ear, and or you would have his friends, it might be a man and a woman, he with his woman, and then they stop by the camp, and then he listening, and then eventually she start trying to leave, pulling on his arm, and then Jake, he folds, so he go right along with her. It's a lot of different examples. It's another example, when it comes to the unicorn, this word being spread throughout the earth via social media, via the internet. You got people all around the earth that hear this word, but some, they get caught up in all of these other ideologies and doctrines. They get caught up and they stumble from these false prophets out here, from these other Israelite groups that are not preaching the 100% truth. These, and I'm speaking of these groups that acknowledge themselves as being Hebrew Israelites. But even outside of that, you got the Christians, you got all of these different religions. These are different sources and outlets that pull our people away from the truth, because there's only one truth. So right when that truth is implanted within them, and they can kind of see it, they can understand it, Satan comes immediately, as it says in verse 15, and takes it out of their hearts. But if that was to happen, which it does happen, it happens majority, more times than it doesn't, because you got more people that are not of the elect than there is of the elect. And by the elect, I'm speaking of the election to be saved from the, destruction that's coming. When it comes to, those members of the elect that will be saved, this verse 15, this is not going to happen to them, And even if there was a Israelite that was taken away by a Israelite of the elect, that at some point in their walk was taken away by another doctrine or another group, or they might have been woken up to the truth by another group, and they started, preaching with that group, or they joined that group. Eventually, they will all come back to the truth. They will all, come home, because at the end of the day, they will come back to who they are of, and they are of Yahweh Shai, being the sheep of the good shepherd, which is Yahweh Shai, Now this is verse 16, and it reads, "And these are they likewise which are sown on stony ground, who when they have heard the word, immediately receive it with gladness." So they believe it when they hear it, They understand it, and it brings them joy. But it says in verse 17, "And have no root in themselves, and so endure but for a time." Right, so they only endure for a period of time. They don't endure until the end, And it says, "And have no root in themselves." That's why, because if you look at a tree that's just sprouting, or like a tree that's, let me compare it to something. A tree that's the size of your average children's scooter, the bar that the child holds onto when they pushing. A tree that's the height of that, when it comes to the roots are not that deep. You know, the bigger the tree gets, the more firm it gets. You know, the stronger the tree gets in general, the deeper the roots are getting. You know, the deeper the roots grow. You know, so when it comes to storms, when it comes to heavy winds, when it comes to water, you know, the deeper those roots are, you know, the more they have expanded, you know, the stronger that tree will be, you know, and the more that it will be able to withstand, you know. But as verse 17 says, and have no root in themselves. So they received the truth with gladness, but they didn't have, you know, roots within themselves. So, you know, they weren't deeply rooted in this truth. They weren't getting the knowledge, the wisdom, and the understanding. You know, they were not holding fast to the truth. You know, when it comes to being hearers and doers, you know, they were more of a hearer than a doer. You know, and speaking to myself, firstly, you know, we got to be more doers than just hearers, because you know our faith is shown through our works. You know, the scriptures say faith without works is dead, so we show our faith through our works. You know, so ultimately those works, they help you grow deep, more deeply rooted in the truth. You know, reading, you know, doing lessons, just studying, fellowshipping, being charitable, you know, speaking to myself firstly, you know, because we all, you know, get weak in the flesh, you know, we deal with these temptations, we fall short, you know, we not perfect, but at the end of the day, you know, we gotta hold ourselves accountable, because at the end of the day, it's just us and the Heavenly Father. You know, it's us walking in that straight gate, you know. So when it comes to our walk, we gotta, you know, we just gotta continue to grow and, you know, allow those roots to expand. Because when you look at a plant, if you put it in a small pot, you got a smaller plant, you put it in a small pot, it's only gonna grow but so big. It's only gonna grow but so many leaves until it kind of just, you know, stunts and just kind of stagnates. And that's because you putting it in a box. You limiting the growth of the roots. The roots can only grow but so much in a pot, depending on the size. But if you take that same plant and put it in a bigger pot, it will begin to grow more fruit. It will begin to sprout more buds. You know, it will begin to grow stronger, you know, more fruitful. So when it comes to this truth, you know, we are being planted in the earth. We not being put in a box. We not being planted in a pot. You know, we being planted in the earth where our roots can grow infinitely. Because, you know, this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of this truth is infinite. We have been given this 100% truth, and everything that we have been given for a reason, you know, for the ultimately the service of our power, so that we can serve and you know, wake up the sheep. So everything that we have been given in this time period, you know, in these last days, it was for a reason, you know, and the Heavenly Father revealed the 100% truth to his men, you know, for them to go out and preach this truth to the rest of the flock and bring them in, you know. But ultimately, hold on, I'm gonna just continue reading in verse 17. It reads, and so endure but for a time. Afterward, when affliction or persecution ariseth for the word's sake, Right. Just as our forefathers was persecuted, Yahweh Shai being the top example, you know, we will be persecuted in these days, you know, and persecution is already coming. It's more so on a vocal, oral, level at this point. It's not really on a physical level at this point, but we are being persecuted right now, and you got a lot of Israelites that can't take that persecution. They can't take that hate and that worldly backlash that they receive by from confidently preaching this truth without trying to sugarcoat it, without trying to spare people's feelings, without trying to fit in certain aspects with certain people in the world, so you kind of don't say certain things. They can't handle that. They can't handle being bold in this truth because ultimately their roots were not deep enough. They weren't invested enough in this truth. That's what that means. It says, or persecution ariseth for the word's sake. Right. That's what persecution is coming for the preaching of the truth. They will persecute us due to us preaching this 100% truth, because ultimately it's for the destruction of this kingdom, which the majority of the inhabitants of the earth, they want this kingdom to remain, but it says immediately they are offended. Right. So they, when they're offended, they ultimately fall out. They ultimately, you see a lot of these Israelites denouncing being Hebrew Israelites, or saying it's a cult, or this and that, trying to paint it in a bad light. Ultimately they just were not deeply rooted enough. They when it comes to their understanding, their wisdom, and their knowledge, they didn't have enough of it when it comes to the 100% truth, and ultimately the Spirit of the Lord was just not working with them, and that's why they were offended in the end, because they were blinded ultimately. But it says in verse 18, and these are they which are sown among thorns, such as hear the word, and the cares of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches, and the lust of other things entering in choke the word, and it becometh unfruitful. Right. So they received the word, but, the seed is sown in their mind, but their mind is full of thorns, being all of these different spirits that they are allowing to dwell within them. These left-handed energies, these left-handed spirits, and then you got them on these other people, specifically Esau, Edom, being the physical embodiment of the spiritual demon Satan. He be coming out with these covenants, agreements, these 5013C Israelites. That's part of what this is talking about. Verse 19 literally says, and the deceitfulness of riches, and the lust of other things entering in. Right. So our people are deceived with riches. You got a lot of people that are celebrities that have heard this truth, but they couldn't give up the riches that they received in the world. Therefore, they chose the world and their status and their riches over, being humble and, giving up everything for this truth. They ultimately fall in this category. Then you got these Hebrew Israelites that know also the truth, and they still preach and profess as if they are doing the work of the Heavenly Father, in righteousness. But ultimately, they have been taken away either by money, by lust of women, by all manners of lust, like it says, and the cares of this world. When it comes to certain things within the scriptures, like the dietary law, you got a lot of Israelites that they buck up against the dietary law. So you got Hebrew Israelite camps out here that preach that you can eat certain abominable foods. You got certain Hebrew Israelite camps out here that preach that you can have long hair. You got certain Hebrew Israelite camps that preach, and when I say long hair, I'm talking about a man having long hair, because that's an abomination to a man. It's a shame, I meant to say. But you got Hebrew Israelite camps that preach that you can, do it in the butt with your woman. You got Hebrew Israelite camps that preach all of these worldly things, things that are of the world that they are still attached to. And that's part of their lust, entering in and choking the truth out. Because through their lust and them not being able to give it up, they allow that to choke out the truth that would have been able to, cause all of those spirits to flee. The spirits of all of those lust and the worldly cares and the deceitfulness of riches. But it was choked out. The word was choked out of them. And that's ultimately due to predestination. They were not selected and elected to receive this word and believe in this word until the end. That's just the bottom line. But it says in verse 20, and these are they which are sown on good ground, such as hear the word and receive it. Right, they receive it. So they take it in. Let's grab that word receive, because it says they receive it. It says to receive, take up, take upon oneself. Right, so they're putting it on. It says to admit, not to reject, to accept. Right, so they accept this truth. They receive it. Like it says, of a son to acknowledge as one's own. Right, so this right here is talking about the ultimately the elect, because when they hear this word, they receive it, they accept it, and they see it as being of them. They see it as being, it's pretty much like being welcomed back home, So ultimately, when it comes to those who, the seed was sown on good ground, they were able to receive it. They still have all of these different spirits trying to tempt them and cause them to fall away, sending different attacks their way, different fiery arrows to afflict them and cause them to grow weak. But ultimately, the Heavenly Father, through the Spirit, purges those spirits out. Those spirits are purged through that truth, that word that they accepted, that they held on to, that they accepted as being a part of them, and that's ultimately why the truth is not choked out of the elect, which verse 20 is speaking of, because they put it on, they put on the truth, it became a part of them. So everything that is not of the truth, it can't affect the elect, because they are the truth. You know, they become one with this truth. You know, even though we're not perfect, and I'm not saying I'm of the elect, but Lord willing, we are. But even though we're not perfect in these bodies, you know, we ultimately, through the Spirit, we are made perfect in service. When it comes to our faith, when it comes to our love towards one another, when it comes to our just our overall spiritual works, our knowledge in the truth, our knowledge in the scriptures, we are continuously every day made more and more perfect, being within these imperfect bodies. But it says, and receive it and bring forth fruit. Right. When you plant some crops outside, you got to tend to them and keep all of the weeds away, because the weeds either choke out your plants and kill them, or they stunt the growth. So your plants aren't as fruitful, you know? But this is the good ground, as it says. So the Heavenly Father is constantly, nurturing and tending to that ground, helping purge out spirits, which are those weeds, helping uproot those spirits, which are those weeds, out of your mind, out of your spirit, and it says, and bring forth fruit, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100, right? According to every man, everybody was given their gift and their lot, but ultimately, everything I just read, this is all showing, because this is all through the spirit and power of the Lord. The sower was sent by the Heavenly Father to sow this word, and whether it was sown on stony ground, whether it was sown on, in the midst of thorns, or whether it was sown on good ground, it's all of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, and ultimately our power is the only one that gives the increase. We sow the seed as the sowers, the prophets, and as, brothers do more lessons, those who have been woken up and that seed was sown in them, brothers, they pretty much give water to nurture those seeds. But ultimately, the Heavenly Father is the only one that can allow that water to actually cause that seed to sprout and grow into a plant. Whether it be a wicked plant or a righteous plant, that's also up to the Heavenly Father. But I'm about to go into that. Now, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 7, and I'm going to close it out on here just to grab that point of what I was just talking about. It says, so then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth. Right. So the planter, the prophets that are waking up specific men, like if you got a man, you out preaching on the streets, you got an Israelite come up to you and you plant that seed in his mind, it's not up to you for that seed to sprout. There's nothing that you can do. And also it says, neither he that watereth. Right. So after that seed is planted and you got that Israelite that has that seed planted being watered by other by more and more information regarding the truth, from more and more lessons being brought to them, or them continuing to come out to camp and receiving that water. Ultimately, it says right here, but Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai that giveth the increase. Right. So it's the Heavenly Father that gives that increase. It don't matter how much water you put on the seed of a 2/3 Israelite, it's not gonna sprout to be a righteous plant. You know, it might not even sprout. It's all up to the Heavenly Father. You know, but at the end of the day, the bottom line and the point of this lesson was you got the sowers that sow the seed, and you got, you know, those who water that seed and nurture it, which is going hand in hand with the sowers, you know. But the sowers is specifically talking about in those moments where a specific Israelite that is preaching the truth wakes up a Israelite and plants that seed in his mind, you know, and that watering is going into, you know, them receiving more after being woken, you know, being awakened, you know, them being nurtured and, you know, taught more. But ultimately, it's the Heavenly Father that will allow those things to cause that seed to sprout and be fruitful, you know. And it's also the Heavenly Father that decides if it will be on stony ground, if it will be among thorns, or if it will be planted on good ground so that it can grow, you know, fruitful. You know, it's all in the Heavenly Father's hands. And that's the point of this lesson. So I hope you brothers and sisters was edified. Satan been messing around with this specific lesson. I had to start like 5 different recordings. I'm about to have to edit it all. But I hope that I was able to bring this lesson out clearly and that the point was brought out, you know, how I intended it to be brought out through the Spirit, you know. So with that, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai Ba'ashim Rakakradash. Double honors to the elders and apostles. And shalom to all of the Akim that's listening. Shalom.